Welcome back to the Darius Gant Show. I'm your host, Darius Gant, as well as founder and CEO of Tesoro AI, where we help innovative founders and executives scale their AI solutions and AI teams. On this podcast, we focus on cutting-edge technology, more specifically, artificial intelligence. By getting up close and personal with these visionary AI founders, we dive into just how AI is impacting us in our real lives and in business. And we get some extra insight into just how these AI founders are scaling up their companies. Hey guys, forgive me if my face is a little swollen here. I got all 4 wisdom teeth pulled just the other day. But hey, we got to keep the show rocking. In this episode, we sit with Micheal Bingham, who is the CEO and founder of a company by the name of xIris. xIris focuses its AI efforts on ensuring public safety. It automatically monitors security cameras for violent crimes, which allows law enforcement to respond more quickly and more effectively. xIris is one of the hot new startups in AI based in New York City. It was recently named by Bill 10 as one of the top 50 startups in New York City. Micheal himself is quite impressive. He was on a full scholarship at NYU, which is where he started the company. His efforts have received the support of popular accelerators such as Plug and Play. Micheal shares some really valuable nuggets on how to go from zero to AI startup. So this should be an interesting conversation that I'm sure you'll enjoy. If you or your team is considering building an AI solution, be sure to reach out to the team here at Tesoro AI. We've assembled the leading experts in data science and machine learning. So whether you're looking for AI strategy, custom AI software development, staff augmentation, or data labeling, we got a strong team here that has your back. Head over to www.tesoroai.com. All right, without further ado, let's hop into the show and hear from Micheal. All right, Micheal, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. So I wanted to kick things off with really understanding your background, right? So I thought it was interesting that, and what I read is that you started a software company in high school.
That's correct. Back then, I started a social media company. It was called Swap. So essentially, it was this mobile app. Each user had a QR code. We called it a swap code, which is basically a pre-designed QR code. Whenever someone would scan your swap code, it would automatically add them on Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, even LinkedIn, and also import their contact information inside your phone. So essentially, it was this social media consolidation tool.
So in high school, you already had an interest in software and technology? I'm really curious where that interest derived from.
I would say that the interest in the sciences started sometime in middle school from my 8th grade science teacher. He taught us physics, and since then I started studying myself physics, mathematics, and really what all software engineering is mathematics, but on a more applicable level. Mathematics, physics are the more fundamental sciences, the foundations of this. I've always wanted to be an inventor. I used to watch Jimmy Neutron a lot when I was a kid. And I figured that, hey, hardware is a little bit expensive to build, but software, everyone has a computer. I can usually learn how to code. So sometime in high school, I actually taught myself C++, Java, Python, and that's where I began my software endeavors.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's great to even you got entrepreneurial experience before you hit 20. So now you ended up going to NYU for college. Did you know going in that you wanted to be locked in on a career in technology? Did you know you were going to start a company? How were you thinking about that in that phase of your life?
So I'll rewind to my decision to go into NYU actually. So I remember, I think it was either 2005 or 2008. I can't remember the exact year, but I was living with my grandparents at the time. It was summer, and I was watching Good Morning America, and Alicia Keys was playing the famous Empire State of Mind song in New York. So I figured that that's when I first fell in love with the city. That's when I fell in love in New York. I grew up in a small town in Jackson, Mississippi, and then moved to Atlanta sometime in high school. So moving to the city, going to a big city, going to NYU has always been a dream of mine. Even though the school in particular I have been necessarily the goal until later on in college when I was deciding what colleges I wanted to apply to. I knew that someday I wanted to move to New York and I always wanted to start a company. See, I always wanted to be an inventor. So I
Mm-hmm.
figured that once I got my acceptance letter to NYU, I actually got a full ride scholarship there. So
Awesome.
of course, the choice was obvious then because I had a way to get to the city, had a way to pay for it as well, and everything just worked out for me in terms of career. In middle school, high school, I always said that I want to be a physicist, mostly because I want to be an inventor. Even now, I intend to get a PhD in physics sometime in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the choice to get into entrepreneurship happened when I joined this entrepreneurship summer program at MIT. It was called MIT Launch at the time. Now it's called Launch X. Launch X. That's actually where I started Swap, the social media company.
Okay.
So going into college, I knew what I wanted to major in. I studied physics and mathematics. I minored in computer science. I knew what I wanted to do. I always had a plan to start a company. So yeah.
And so then I guess were you taking at NYU? Obviously, you had the computer science class, so you had some exposure to data science, machine learning, which gave you some basis to starting the company that you are running today, xIris.
Correct, correct. All machine learning really is. It's just mathematics.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how folks with that heavy math background, generally, it's a lot easier for them to learn the machine learning. I remember when I was taking some of the courses offered through Stanford, actually Andrew Ng's machine learning course, it was taking
Oh
me back to math that I'm like, I have not seen this since my junior year of high school, right? And I'm like, geez, I got to go way back into into the back of my mind to remember this stuff. But okay, so xIris, I saw that. Congratulations! I saw you guys were recognized by Built-in as one of New York's top 50 AI startups. So definitely, congrats on that. Would love to learn more about what pain point did you see in the market where you were like, look, I need to start xIris. Give us some background to the lead up into founding this startup.
of course. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, a small town. But what a lot of people don't know is that it's actually one of America's most dangerous cities if you adjust it
Mm,
by population. There's lots of theft, robbery, murders, and tons of gun violence. And I remember being younger, and I said that, hey, that most cities, most towns are very densely populated with cameras. But what a lot of people don't know is that even though there are cameras everywhere, there's never someone behind watching them. Even though cameras owned by police departments, they don't have a staff monitoring these
right.
cameras. They don't have the resources for it or the human power for it. And also, they sometimes consider a waste of time because what's the likelihood that you will actually see a crime committed on camera when you're watching it?
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that most violent crimes are actually caught on camera. And because there's no one watching the cameras, 50% of violent crimes, they go unreported just because there was no one there watching it. Cameras are typically only useful until after a crime has already occurred. So
Right.
that's why I found that there was a problem there because it takes the police, on average, for a large city like Chicago, LA, and New York, about 15 minutes to respond to an emergency or an incident. And a 911 call itself, the time that it takes for someone to say, people have a gun here, or people are fighting here, or there's a car accident, that can take 3 to 5 minutes.
Mm,
So my vision was that even if we can shave off the 3 to 5 minutes that it takes for someone to identify a crime, that we could potentially save a lot of lives. So that's where the kind of idea, the formation behind Iris came from. Since humans weren't watching these cameras, when I built machines to watch these cameras to automatically
right.
alert law enforcement whenever something does happen. So that was the inspiration behind the company. The idea itself, I had sometime in high school, but of course back then I didn't have the mathematics or
Yeah.
machine learning. That's where NYU came to use. That's where my mathematics education came to use, and where that's where it all began.
Okay. Okay. And so, what type of crime? What type of activity? Well, let me ask this: are there specific types of activity that you all are detecting?
Yes, it is. So currently our AI detects about 13 different cases of abnormality. So it ranges between gunfires, physical violence like assaults, physical fights, and such. even car accidents, cases of arson, so people burning things and vandalism. Aside from that, we really want to train our AI to learn what a general crime looks like. So the second model to it can actually detect if there's something abnormal happening in a scene, because the core technology of it is a video classification algorithm. Similar to an image classification algorithm that can tell the difference between a cat and a dog, we teach our machines, we teach our software to recognize what's happening inside of the video. So even though on paper that it detects about 13 different cases of abnormalities, in general, our AI learns over time that, hey, this should not be happening here, whether it's a group of people standing in a parking lot. Now, it may not necessarily know what they're doing, but it knows that this is not that normally happens here. So let's call the authorities, or let's call someone that's responsible for this area so that they can take a look at it.
And is it generating an alert to someone who would then call the authorities, or is the actual call to the authorities automated?
Of course. So it depends on the severity of it. If it's someone vandalizing, we don't typically call the police then. We just alert the property. But if it's something a little bit more severe, like a fight or even a gunfire or a weapon, in those cases, first, this footage is sent to our independent human monitoring team. They work 24/7. They can recognize and verify a threat in real time. They take no more than 3 to 5 seconds to identify it, and then we automatically call the police.
Yeah, I definitely think that's interesting, because it takes the burden off you. Well, I would say, let's say off the machine, right? For having to say whether something is definitely a violent crime or definitely not, or even like in the case of vandalism, maybe it's not vandalism. It's like they're building and they're spraying graffiti on there and they wanted to do it, right? But like, you at least have the human in the loop who can determine, all right, is this or is this not something that's worth reaching out to?
We don't want to call something like a pencil a gun.
Right. So then, because I can think of a lot of instances where you can, in a lot of different locations where you can have these types of events. You got schools, airports, in the public in general. The cameras, and cameras are in all of these places. Is there a specific group that you are focused on today?
For the most part, to answer your question, we target commercial buildings. So the initial goal for us was to tailor, really reach for the public safety market, police departments, law enforcement agencies, because it's really a public safety product.
Right.
But it's that private industry, we mostly center towards schools, office buildings, construction sites, even when they're trying to detect safety hazards there, churches, places of worship like mosques and temples, pretty much anywhere where people gather together and there's a threat to public safety. So even though we don't have a specific group that we only target, is really just any place that has cameras.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting in high growth space. I remember as an investor, we had looked at a number of public safety applications, and that came from organizations such as schools wanting to make sure that students walking on campus were safe, right? Okay, so you got so now you've got the technology built. I'd love to go back and learn the process for actually getting to that point. In this case, you yourself kind of had some of that, the background to put the initial product together. Did you yourself build the MVP? Did you work together with the CTO? How did that come together?
I did. So initially, I developed it. I was working on it alone for about, I would say, 6 months before officially forming the company. So me, myself, I invented the MVP. I did the initial algorithm, and then I invited a few other members of my team to help me build the UI part of it. So there's an actual user interface that our customer gets to where they can see all the cameras they have added to their dashboard, any notifications, so any alerts, they pop up on that dashboard, and is sent by text message as well. So that user interface, that platform, was built by new members I decided to add to the team later. But the MVP itself was something that I created myself.
Interesting. So the UI came later, and obviously that's an important part. I'm curious, the MVP that you initially built, what did it look like? At least, and apart from like you building out the I saw you guys had proprietary algorithm, but apart from that, right?
Yeah.
The initial MVP that you presented to folks without having built out that UI first, what did that look like?
Initially, it was just software, basically in terminal. They didn't see that part, of course, because it looks ugly.
Yeah.
So what I would do is just integrate the software into their cameras automatically. They wouldn't see how this process works. But what really caught their attention was sometimes, like if I'm presenting to a store or someplace, bringing a toy weapon or a toy gun, and then I would set up the alerts on their phone. So whenever I walk in with a toy weapon, and then the camera automatically picks up on it, then they see a text message pop up on their phone that, hey, this person has a gun here. Should we call the police? So the initial version of the MVP was all the software was in the back end, so they couldn't see it. It was invisible. We didn't have the UI framework at the time.
Yeah.
What they saw was the text notifications on their phone whenever we picked up on an alert.
An interesting way to get up and running. Now, to speak more about the AI piece, right? Data is always the major hurdle to overcome first. It's interesting because as startups, right, it's not like an enterprise where you may have a bunch of data that's organized, clean, ready to go that you can begin to train a model. So what was your process as you thought about training this model? What was your process with collecting the data, cleaning the data?
Of course. So pre-training and transfer learning, which is a popular machine learning technique, that was something that was essential. Similar to how there were image classification algorithms before in the past, but they weren't as effective until Google released their ImageNet dataset. So similar to that, for video classification, there's the YouTube 8M dataset, there's the Kinesthetics dataset. There were a lot of different data sets released just for video classification in general. I used those data sets in order to get a pre-trained version of the model or the transfer lane of the model. Now, in terms of collecting data for crime detection, luckily, universities and different institutions were already doing research on detecting abnormalities of surveillance cameras. So what we would do was just partner, reach out to those universities, ask them, can we have a copy of that data?
Yeah.
And then thankfully, they released it to us. So that was mostly the kind of generation behind our training data. What we're doing now is experimenting with kind of computer animated data, kind of similar to game engines, how game engines automatically make up environments. If you've ever played Grand Theft Auto or any game like that, it turns out that a computer can't really tell too much of a difference between an animated fight or a real fight. It's both bad for us because it's good because we can use that data to train, but it's also bad because you can't really tell the difference. But in real life, I actually going to ever see a video game on the camera, so that's normally how that went.
Yeah, interesting. So video, labeling data for video can be pretty intensive.
Very intensive. It is. So with that, a lot of the labeling was done with us because the thing is that you got to take things frame by frame, but you also have to split frames into something that's reasonable and reliable. Because if your camera is taking 120 frames per second, you really only need 1 frame per second. So the first challenge was figuring out how many frames per second or how many frames per 10 or 3 seconds to even use for the algorithm or video classification. The second challenge was actually labeling the abnormality itself. So you put in a boundary box over it, and making sure that your algorithms aren't just learning how to classify the video and actually learning how to regress for new data. So that was pretty challenging. What kind of helped us was, particularly for video classification, since it's not as developed as the image classification space. So we had to do a lot of experimentation. We had to come up with our own algorithms. We had to resort to literature, so see what other people did as well, what kind of pre-processing techniques they use for their videos, because reading video can be computationally expensive and heavy as well. So that's what we also had to accommodate for.
Yeah. Now, did you all, in terms of kind of that annotation process, did you handle that internally? Did you look for at external vendors or maybe even a combination of both with an automated solution?
Yeah, for our MVP, it was all me initially annotating the data. As we grew and as we received investment capital, then that's when we started research into vendors offshore. So a lot of people reach LinkedIn and say, hey, do you guys need machine learning? Really, a lot of those times you would ignore those messages, but then one time the day came to where we had the capital for it and we had a need for it, and we started working with vendors. So those they're pretty helpful because it takes off the pain from us, and it can be this task reading through all of these videos, especially for crimes, because you don't really want to look at.
I was watching an interesting TV series where they had folks who were, it was based on a crime show, and they had folks who were the folks responsible for deciding whether a video submitted to a social media platform was acceptable or not. And the folks who were reviewing these videos, they had seen so much craziness that they themselves started to have weird behavior. So it was an interesting show, but it made that what you say, just watching crime videos all the time, it's like,
yeah, not a pleasant thing to do.
Yeah, but also as an entrepreneur, right? As a founder yourself, it's like there are a million other things that I could be doing. This is absolutely something that someone else needs to be doing, where you can then begin to tackle higher value tasks.
Right.
In regards to that process, right? Were there any specific learning lessons that you took away, where if you were to do it all over again, you could get through it more efficiently?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that if I could do it over again, I would prioritize obtaining data and labeling data, because it really doesn't matter it matters how good your algorithms are, don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, your AI is only good as your data. And a lot of the times when we think we have a good algorithm, we have a small subset of data, and our AI performs well on it, but when you deploy it in the real world, on a validation data set, you may get something like with a 97% accuracy, but in the real world, you see that number drop down to 30%, and you're wondering what happened. It's because you can train your AI on enough data. So I think that if I did have to do it over again, I would definitely, in the beginning at least, prioritize collecting data and prioritize less on the AI algorithm itself, because that can always be refined, that can always be developed. The key thing for AI, especially in this age of data, is really having big data, a lot of data. It's very important.
Yeah, and very interesting that you all were able to kind of, as I mentioned before, right? You don't all have a proprietary data set from day one, but you're able to leverage some of these partners to be able to use the data that they have. Would love to learn more about that data partnership process, right? How do you even convict? Because this is in my mind sensitive data that some of these organizations have. So what's the process of even beginning to have that conversation about a data partnership where then you can train your model on their data?
Right. I think what kind of helped me a lot was I was actually in school at the time. So having that kind of university affiliation with NYU, having a .NYU edu on the email address, that gave me a little bit more respect when reaching out to different universities. So how I really approached it was I would also go to my professors that were in machine learning AI. I told them about what I'm building, what kind of data I need, and they had contacts at universities that would speak with me. So it's really just leveraging the people that you have in your pre-existing network, and also leveraging the current credentials that you have. Me being a student at the time, they were a lot more willing to hand over the data when it's something for like a learning experience, if it was something that I said that I was doing for research or even for commercial experience. But nevertheless, a lot of times we're afraid to ask people because we don't want to hear no. But the thing is that the worst thing that someone can do is say no. They're not going to. Nothing bad is going to happen if you ask them for their data. So even though it can be a little bit of a daunting and difficult process when partnering with these organizations, a lot of the times what we did was just ask them, or what the number one priority was making sure that we checked to see if there was someone in our existing network who knew them, so they can give us a warm introduction there. So that's how that data partnership works beyond that.
And was the idea at that time that these partnerships would eventually turn into customers?
Yeah, that was the idea at the time. A lot of times that may not particularly be the case, particularly with startups, since enterprise clients are a little bit more hesitant when working with startups. It takes a little bit more work. The timelines are a little bit more extended. Even now, we have a few deals in the pipeline with a few large companies that are taking months to close.
Yeah.
Sometimes even years, just because things move slow in the corporate world, particularly when you're dealing with a startup. But to answer your question about them turning into clients, since a lot of the partnerships from data came from universities, we never really particularly thought that a university would be our customer, at least not yet at the time, only because the approval process for being a vendor, as we learned, for a university, for a private institution, can be daunting as well. So you have that's are in there so that we can, so that they're familiar with us, so that they know who we are, and then eventually down the road, we would approach to a massive vendor.
And so after those partnerships, that was the initial entry into the market, right? How did you then go about, acquiring other clients? Was this kind of, did you begin some type of marketing campaign or still even leveraging some of the context that you had as a student?
Mostly leveraging context that we had through accelerators as well. We joined the Plug and Play Accelerator.
Okay.
We got a few warm introductions from our investors that invested into us. See, the thing about us is that with marketing a product like this, if you go to someone and say, hey, I have an AI that can detect crimes, it sounds good and all, but a lot of people are not really familiar with that as they do with something like T. So this takes a little bit of market education, educating your market, educating your customer on what this is, how this can be helpful to you, how this can be useful for you. And for that reason alone, that's why warm introductions are so important when you're selling B2B, because it's not like a consumer product where you can just hold an ad online, hold an ad on Instagram, hope someone will click on it, hope someone will like it. If you're selling a business, you got to reach out. You got to do cold emails. You got to cold call. You got to do whatever you can in order to just get in front of their face, and sometimes offer things for free as well, just so that you can get them on the hook. So that's how that process worked. Mostly just taking advantage of the people that we already knew, our investors, people from Plug to introduce us to the companies that said that they had a particular need, even if it wasn't for crime detection. As I mentioned earlier, we found an application for construction sites so they can help detect construction hazards. That idea actually came through a company that we met through Plug and Play. So a lot of these times, a lot of these things have occurred for we found new use cases and applications that we did not even usually plan. Even now, we've been focusing on capacity control, mass detection, social distancing monitoring. That wasn't the initial vision for it, but that's something that's working for us.
Right. Yeah. Which is interesting, right? Because you're always trying to figure out, all right, well, what features are going to be the most valuable and have the highest level of adoption in our target customer base. And I imagine that there's a huge list of those things. Do you have a process of trying to figure out, okay, well, here's what we're actually going to work on versus we'll push that further down on the product roadmap?
What we do is we sell it before developing it. So a lot of times we may approach our clients, or if someone has an idea for a new feature or for a new detection, like we reach out to customers, we reach out to these churches, to these buildings, these restaurants who had capacity restrictions, and said, hey, do you guys need help counting the amount of people that's entering and exiting? This is before we even wrote a single line of code and develop a capacity control solution. So we kind of like to test the market interest first before we do a final approval on it, because the one thing that we don't want to do is allocate time, allocate resources, allocate capital to a feature that's going to be heavily intensive for us to implement, but not useful.
Yeah, definitely interesting, insight, especially. I think folks who are very tech savvy, there's always this juggle between, I think all of these features would be awesome to add, and your mind is consistently spinning with ideas, but then it's, all right, well, let's test this assumption. in the market and see if it's worth building first, right?
Right. That's actually a lesson I kind of learned from my first startup with the software app. We kept implementing features, a feature this week, a feature this week. But you don't want to get constantly stuck in this loop where you're constantly developing and you're not selling. So that's why it's really important to test the space first to see what actually people want before you build it, so they make something they don't want to use this.
I want to change gears a little bit here. And then you mentioned you all were able to get in an accelerator, plug and play. Can you talk a little bit about the process of actually being accepted to the accelerator, and then some of the benefits or pros and cons that you saw being a part of an accelerator as a startup?
Of course, a representative from Plug and Play reached out to us actually a while before we even put in our application. This was actually when we first raised our first round of funding because they saw us on Crunchbase. They asked a little bit about the company and they mentioned briefly their accelerator and asked if we would be interested. And they said that they would keep us in loop in contact when it occurred. So a few months later, they sent us the application to it. We filled out the application, which was a general application for an accelerator. It asks about your founding team, your technology, your value proposition. Attraction is also extremely important to accelerators and extremely important to VCs now. And then after that, we interviewed a few times. It was like a back and forth thing. And then there was a video pitch, and then they finally accepted us. Now, that program itself was a different type of accelerator because, so most accelerators are in person. This one was virtual before everything became virtual. Except that they actually gave us free office space in San Francisco, though. That was one perk of it as well. One thing that I think was a con from that plug and play accelerator is that they actually invest in the companies that are in their cohort, unlike most accelerators. But what they do is they do connect you with venture capitalists that are in their network, and they do connect you with different corporations that may be interested in your product. That was very helpful for us as selling.
So it's like they're not directly investing money into the company, but they're giving you a resource that actually will. So they accomplish the same thing, just in a different way.
Precisely. I think that was a big advantage of it. The biggest advantage I would see to joining the accelerator is, I would say, the name, branding behind it, and also the potential connections that it can give you, because we noticed that for startups, everything is about raising money. And the thing is, for venture capital, they all know each other. So if you know one, it would be no way to get to another one.
Very true. A lot of folks we talk to, it's like, hey, look, I raised from one venture capitalist, and that actually brought in a ton of other interest from other folks. And other things that I've heard is that even for young founders, there's so many things that you need to know, you need to learn, and you can get ahead of that learning curve with access to some of these resources that an accelerator would be able to provide for you. So even small things like what technology you should use for communication, or just various different things for someone who can give you advice on that.
Precisely.
So I'm curious about the team. You got the MVP done, but I'm curious how you then thought about, let me find a co-founder. First couple of hires. How did the co-founder dynamic come together? First, let's start there.
The beautiful thing about being at a university like NYU is that there are a bunch of smart people there who have the same interest in you. So as I was thinking about forming and developing the team, I went to class to see the people around me, particularly my math classes, the people that are more confident in their abilities, and the people who had some free time outside of school and who wanted to build something big, who wanted to be a part of something that I was building. So a lot of the co-founding, the scouting for that, the scouting for team members was, I wouldn't say it was a difficult process at all. A lot of it, because there was a lot of interest, especially after I raised some money. A lot of people came to me and said, hey, we want to join what you're doing. We really like what you do. We want to join on. It was really just a matter of qualifying and to seeing even past the qualification process, because a lot of people, particularly at a school like NYU, a lot of people may be qualified for the position, but maybe you're not a cultural fit. We have to make sure that I like you. I like you to work with you.
Yeah, it's like I was speaking to a buddy who also, he has an AI startup, and he's like, look, it's really a marriage. I mean, from a co-founder perspective, it's a real relationship that you're involved in. So liking someone is is key.
That's actually something I learned later on.
Awesome. So you actually raised a little bit of money before bringing on a co-founder. So the interesting thing with these co-founder dynamics, there's some folks who are like, look, I need to do that immediately. That's the first thing I need to do, is to find a co-founder. And then some folks take the approach where, look, I'll get this thing started, and then down the road, when I have a need that I'm not able to fill, then I'll find a co-founder. Did you take that into account? And I'm curious if there were things that you weighed that kind of led you to look for a co-founder after the MVP, after the initial fundraise that you had.
I think that I took the latter route. So when I saw there was a need, there was something I couldn't do, or something that I may need a little bit of help with. That's why I decided to bring more members onto the team. I think in the beginning, the reason why I did not have anyone on at first is because, hey, this was my idea, this is my baby, and also because I'm an introvert, so I work best solo. I work alone very well, and I didn't really have a need to have other people at the time, particularly when I was building the MVP. I hadn't had any customers yet, and we had not raised any money yet, so I didn't have a need to bring on any team members. I always knew I wanted to bring members onto the team, but I didn't have that need yet. So then once I raised money, I figured that, hey, I have an actual company now. People, we have a name, we have a brand. People want to join. Why not bring more people on for marketing, for sales, and to also help with tech development? Or like I mentioned earlier, so I didn't build the UI because I'm not a UI designer. I'm an AI.
Yeah.
I can't. So I needed someone else for that. So that was my frame of mind in deciding to bring more team members on. The need had to come first, and then the hole had to be dug, and something needed to fill it.
Yeah, and I think for you, it really helped that you had the ball rolling a bit. So it's not like you're looking for a co-founder to fill that need, but you're like, look, there's no business here. There's no product here. You can almost get someone who's potentially more talented, but has more confidence in that you can take some, there's going to be some level of liftoff, right? Because look, we've got a little bit of traction already. So
Right.
Last thing, really quickly on the UI, how did you pick the team or the folks who would help you with UI? And what I've seen is that a lot of times, because adoption is so important, if no one's used the product, it's not, it's not even going to be, the ML can be as smart as you want it to be, but if no one uses it, stuck, right, as a startup, right? So I'm very curious, as you thought about, all right, well, I'm not a UI guy, right? How did you pick the folks who would actually design UI?
I picked the people that are highly intuitive, which is very important for UI, because UI, your user interface has to be intuitive. So I think that an intuitive person has to go to make sure that someone else can use it. And also the people that I did pick were people I was familiar with their previous work, their prior works. So I asked them to show me UI that they've built before. I thought it looked good. I said, hey, I think that you may be able to contribute to the team. So it's really just about seeing someone's, gauging someone's expertise level and seeing if it can fit into the original vision that I have for the product. Because even though I'm not really a UI guy, I had a vision in my head on what it should look like, what it should do. And I was mostly just looking for people who shared a similar vision or who knew how to implement that vision.
Right. Okay. Want to be mindful of time here, but last couple questions. First question is, favorite tech tool to use inside of the company today?
It used to be Monday.com, and then it switched to Asana.
Okay. And Asana is the project management, or I guess I guess the other part of that question should be why.
See, for me, I'm a very organized and very meticulous person. So I like things done in a very specific way, and everything laid out on the front. So how Asana is very helpful is because no one ever has to ask a question on what they should be doing or what's happening or what's going on. It's an easy way for me or anyone else to visualize what's happening in a company, what's being worked on, what's going on, and what needs to be done. So it's a really good tool to keep everything on track, to keep projects on track, and to assign tasks and work to someone, to work with other people. It's much better than using a spreadsheet, and it's a lot more efficient than just calling someone or emailing them and say, hey, can you get this done? People forget, people delete emails, they don't get it a lot.
Yeah.
But just something that's just on a dashboard right there saying, hey, this needs to be done, this is the due date, or this is X amount of done, this is X percentage completed. It's a lot more efficient and a lot better to, it's a good way to visualize what's going on.
Awesome. And then last question here, who is someone that inspires you either in AI or in business generally?
Well, I love this question because it's one person in the world, Sir Isaac Newton. He, you don't get that a lot because a lot of times I think when you ask who inspires you, someone would say someone in business. But me coming from a physics background, of course, my role model is going to be a scientist, Sir Isaac Newton, because he developed the laws of motion, he developed laws in optics. He made so many discoveries, so many fundamental discoveries in science, so many discoveries that were very important for the technologies that we use today. And a lot of it he did when he was young, in his early 20s, all by himself alone. And I think it's someone that I can relate to a lot, being such an introverted, weird character, not having that and being so focused and absorbed in your work, so absorbed in mathematics. I think that he's my role model, definitely number one role model. I really look up to him.
Okay. Yeah, great. Yeah, first Isaac Newton reference that we've had here, but for you, it makes a ton of sense.
It does. It does.
Okay. Well, Michael, thank you for taking some time. Congrats again on the early success that you have. Can definitely see a lot of use for what you guys are building over at xIris, and definitely look forward to seeing the success that is to come, and one day having you back on the podcast for an update.
We'd love to. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no problem.